Our next panel turns to the dramatic changes in science and technology policy, which were previewed earlier. How will these affect AI and AI governance? I am delighted to welcome Julie Brill, former FTC commissioner, to lead our panel through a discussion of where we are and what we do about it.
Thank you. Thanks. I am so excited to be here. This is such an interesting conversation and such a great place to be having it. And I am especially excited because I have the ability to introduce to you a powerhouse panel of incredible thought leaders on this issue. So immediately to my right is current Federal Trade Commissioner Terrell McSweeny. And just to make sure that you all know what the FTC does, my former agency, Terrell's current agency, the FTC is our nation's premier consumer protection agency that focuses on stopping unfair and deceptive actions and unfair methods of competition and spends a great deal of time thinking about data, privacy, and other issues. To Terrell's right is Nicole Wong, my dear friend, who is or was the Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States, and she had previously served as Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Google and Legal Director of Products at Twitter. And then to Nicole's right is Vanita Gupta, the former head of the Department of Justice's Office of Civil Rights, and she is now the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. You can see it's just an unbelievable group of people. Okay, so what I thought we would spend just a nanosecond doing is we've heard a lot about concerns about AI, and I think it's incredibly important to be thinking about those concerns as you're developing governance structures. But as everybody knows who's involved in policy issues, you have to balance concerns against benefits, risks and benefits. And the truth is that artificial intelligence does have a lot of benefits to society. And I think it's important to, at least at a very high level and very briefly, mention those. So, for instance, enhancing efficiency, whether it's in transportation systems or other systems, AI will obviously play a critical role there. Increasing safety, whether it's through autonomous vehicles or in the medical sphere, AI will clearly play a very important role going forward in enhancing safety, improving accuracy, improving security. I know cybersecurity experts who are dying to get their hands on more AI to help them deal with cybersecurity threats. Okay, those are just some of the many, many benefits that we see coming down the road. The risks of AI, you heard a lot about bias on the last panel. There's also opaque decision-making, security and safety vulnerabilities, despite the fact that AI can be used to help in those ways. Sometimes there's going to be some significant problems with respect to security and safety. Upending labor markets, AI displacing certain jobs, certain entire sectors of workers. AI and machine learning also challenges traditional notions of privacy and data protection, including things like individual control, transparency, access, and data minimization. It also, on content and social platforms, can lead to narrowcasting, discrimination, filter bubbles. So we need to figure out ways to balance these tremendous opportunities with some of these risks. And so that's what these brilliant people are going to tell us how we're going to do that. So, okay, let's open it up. First question. Governance, in many ways, can be, when you think about how do we govern AI, in many ways that question ought to really be, well, to whom is AI answerable? Who is responsible for AI, for the inputs, for the outputs, and maybe even for the black box? So let's break this down a little bit before we get to that big question. Let's talk about the current governance gaps. So, Nicole, I'll start with you. Tell me, with all your experience both within companies, especially at the White House, what do you see as the current gaps in governance with respect to AI?
Thank you, Julie. So let me start by thanking Kate and Meredith for putting this together for a second time. It was brilliant the first time. It is still unbelievably highly produced and fabulous the second time around. So I want to thank them for all the work they've done here. So here's the thing. I am no longer in government, and I don't work for a single company, which means I get to talk freely without having my talking points looked at by anyone else. So let me be real about what we're doing in artificial intelligence under the current administration, because my experience was obviously in the past one under Obama. Here's the thing. It may be a little early to be judging this administration and where it will go with artificial intelligence. I will tell you that I have friends who are still there, serving in many areas of government, but including the U.S. digital services, and they're getting very positive signals about using technology to make government more efficient in the delivery of services. So we should take that with as much as we can in terms of hopefulness. I will also say, though, that there's a bunch of signals that are not fabulous. There is a dismissiveness shown in this administration around regulation. There is a dismissiveness of ethical guidance. There's also, and this feeds partly to some of the frameworks that the prior panel talked about, right, which is you have to be conscious of and to want to really interrogate the bias, the racism, the sexism in our existing systems and data sets in order to build meaningful policy around artificial intelligence. And I don't see that desire in the current administration. And I think that we need to focus really hard and push our policymakers in that space. So that's like gaps in this current administration that concern me. There's in artificial intelligence in particular, I feel less that we've retrenched anything because it's early, but that we may be missing opportunities. And there are 3 areas where I think that we really need to focus. The first is to figure out what are the principles by which we measure success of artificial intelligence. I don't think we've agreed on that. Like, what do we want the goals of artificial intelligence to be in any given sector? And until we have those principles, we have nothing to benchmark against. That goes to like a second layer of, I see companies really struggling to figure out who's supposed to make these decisions. Is it the business leader? Is it the technologist? Is it some outside group that's more independent that says your responsibility as a good corporate citizen is to have AI deliver certain types of results? I think that responsibility and accountability doesn't exist currently in our structure, nor do they have anything to market to in terms of principles. And then there's a third really operational level, which I think we see in the privacy field, which is what's the checklist, what's the toolkit that I go into any institution with and say, like, did you check all these boxes to make sure we're doing this right? How do I build a process and tools to ensure the quality of these systems? And I don't think we have that yet.
Great. Terrell, what do you think? Governance gaps, what do you think?
Well, I'll also start by saying thank you to everybody for organizing the terrific conference, and thank you to you, Julie, for introducing us. Like Nicole, I don't work for a company either. I do work for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, though. But if I say the following disclaimer, I can give you my independent view, just like Nicole. So I'll just say I'm not representing the official views of the FTC, nor those necessarily shared by my colleague, Acting Chairman Olhausen. And I'll launch right in, because we're talking about governance gaps under the Trump administration, to say that I think Nicole's right, that we have a big opportunity to try to shape the debate here around governance and ethical concerns around AI, and that it will be a shame if the administration doesn't continue to use its platform as a convener to try to facilitate that conversation. Certainly at the Federal Trade Commission, we're looking carefully at these issues, and I think we have something to offer. Over time, as you know well, Julie, from your terrific work on privacy and security at the FTC has been very focused on privacy by design and security by design, concepts that really take transparency, notice, and choice, but also a process-based approach, much like you're talking about, to these notions of privacy and security that are so complex and so dynamic. And so what I think we can do with these frameworks is adapt them as the technology gets smarter. So I think we can come up with governance by design. I think we can come up with ethics by design ultimately. But it's going to take a lot of conversation about what those key components are. I'd argue probably for explainability, data quality, testing, some sort of mitigation. But first and foremost, I think Nicole's making the right point, which is we need to understand organizationally who is in charge of these decisions. And relatedly, as a law enforcement official, I need to understand which humans I'm going to be holding accountable for machine decision-making as well, which is a big challenge, and I'm not sure we've fully thought it through yet.
Vanita, what do you see as the gaps that we're currently struggling or we should be struggling to fill?
So I probably am taking the most pessimistic view here on stage, and part of that is related to watching a Sessions Justice Department undo a lot of the civil rights work that we were doing, particularly in criminal justice reform and policing, where there's been such a significant retreat, forget AI, from even understanding and diagnosing and remedying problems of discrimination in human decision-making in these sectors, such that I really do worry about, when I was at the Civil Rights Division, we were kind of at the cusp of having some serious conversations with our state, local, and federal law enforcement partners about AI, about predictive policing, about pretrial risk assessment instruments that were using AI. And there is, this is a law and order administration that has done such a retreat on all kinds of aspects of reform, kind of run by humans, that even thinking that there's going to be any kind of pressure brought to bear by the administration on investigating in a really serious way the ways in which, I can speak about law enforcement, is going to be looking at AI, I think there's a huge gap there. And what I'm excited about is that, AI, the AI Now initiative, and the private sector really do need to step up in this space and kind of there already, I think, has been significant leadership in the private space, but I can't wait for the government at this point to be putting that pressure on in the way that we might have in an administration that cared about facts and science and fighting discrimination. Because the reality is that, when there was a Justice Department that was willing at least to begin to investigate some of these questions, you had funding streams that could fund research through the Office of Justice Programs, through NIJ, through any number of issues. You had a White House that was working with AI Now on the convening last year and really beginning to say across agencies, how do you deal with these questions in health and labor and criminal justice and the like? And for most of us, we aren't feeling that kind of pressure brought to bear. And so right now, I think there really is a very serious set of questions about what kind of transparency there is with vendors that are using AI. And I'm going to speak about the criminal justice and policing context specifically, where in criminal justice systems writ large, there is so much racial discrimination and racial bias that some of it is structural, some of it is implicit bias, that we really have to contend with, being able to understand and get through the black box of what vendors are using as their algorithms to produce this stuff. I was just looking at PredPol online, a predictive policing company that's a little bit further along in doing this research, and on their website it says, well, it only uses 3 data points in making predictions: past types of crime, place of crime, time of crime. It uses no personal information about individuals or groups of individuals, eliminating any personal liberties or profiling concerns. That's on their website. Really? Part of the problem here is that even if the private sector isn't even willing to admit that there are serious concerns and questions about this stuff in a real way, then, without pressure from government and without those kinds of gaps being filled, I think that we have not only, I think, we have a political will problem among some of the companies that are propagating this stuff. We have a research issue, and then we have to have an ability to really advance and engage these questions in a real way. And I believe that civil rights groups and civil liberties groups need to be at the table with the researchers, with the companies that are doing this stuff in a very real way. The leadership conference just a few years ago with the ACLU and other groups created some principles about this stuff that were principles of inquiry, really, very basic, as a way of helping provide some guidance for the ways in which AI is being used, particularly with regards to communities of color in this very imbalanced power structure in criminal justice, where the consumers are also the victims of racially biased or biased AI. And so, I do think the private sector has to fill this gap, because the conversation, at least in the criminal justice environment, but also in others, around issues of discrimination has changed so wildly.
Wow, terrific. So, let's talk a little bit about what are the institutions that we can bring to bear to deal with AI. Vanita, you just talked about consumer groups and civil liberties groups as well as private sector. Terrell, you mentioned the FTC has a role to play and can do that. But what I'd love you each to do is a little bit of a thought experiment. If you could create an agency, or if you actually let's make it more real world. If you could pick an entity that exists now, where do you think that this conversation should be happening? Who is best suited, or what is best suited? What agency, what entity is best suited to deal with some of these issues? And let me tee this up. I mean, we talked a little bit about some of the federal institutions, right? The FTC, the White House, DOJ, pretty important institutions. Obviously, now we have some issues with whether, there is a will to go forward in some of those institutions, not necessarily the FTC, but the others. There's the state attorneys general, who have their hands full dealing with lots of other issues, maybe not AI. Is going to be first on their mind. We've got the European regulatory scheme, and there's a lot of things happening in Europe right now, including a law that is going to be coming online in May of 2018, which actually addresses some profiling issues. It addresses some automated processing issues in a very process-oriented way, actually, and not so much in an outcome-oriented way. And then we have standard-setting organizations. We have the potential for ethical boards. We have the potential for international organizations. My personal favorite is the OECD. Nicole, you and I talked about this, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which was an entity that created the fair information principles used by privacy professionals, has been in use for decades now at this point. So maybe they should be developing principles for AI use. But I'm interested in what you all think. So who wants to go first? Ideal governance structure. Nicole, you wanna give it a whirl?
I'll give it a whirl, and then I kind of elide through not quite answering the question, but
that's okay. You can take that prerogative.
Because I think it matters what part of AI you want to regulate, right? So because there are different things that we want to think about. One is, I'm going to go back to the principles problem. We have a real principles problem. Can we agree not just here in the United States or with our Western partners, but globally on a set of principles around the development of AI? Because I think we should not discount the rapid progression that China is making in the area of AI, and bear in mind, right, the norms that they have around individualism versus collectivism, about openness versus closed, about privacy versus and censorship. They will not be the same. The training data will not be the same. So who develops the frameworks around these things and gets it deployed first will matter. And so global principles are going to have a really big part in how we set our overall frameworks. And it's going to matter who goes out first. And so if we can have an entity like an OECD, and I don't know if that's the right one, but it's got a lot of the countries in it, right? Mm-hmm. To develop something equivalent to the fair information privacy principles, that might be a really good start. So that's one. But there are other components of AI, which I think that would be a terrible place to do it. Like, who makes a determination about whether or not AI deployed in a financial institution, in a healthcare institution, in a commercial enterprise is fit for purpose? What's the right regulator for that? And I love the FTC, and I love a lot of the models that they've done for regulation, but I also feel like the generalist position for those regulators is not going to have enough understanding of the landscape for particular sectors to say, you know what, your data's not right. You know what, you didn't include X. I just don't know that they're going to be qualified for that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that might be a different set of regulators. And then there's the question of automation and the displacement of labor. If we want to solve that problem, whose problem is that? right? And my gut says we're either creating a new entity or we've got to get a bunch of existing agencies together to work on that problem.
Or focus on income transfer, just generally speaking, which is not necessarily going to be any agency other than the IRS or the WTO or something along those lines. Terrell, what do you think?
I'm definitely not going to take on the labor question as a FTCer. But I am going to agree with what Nicole just said, because I think she said a couple of important things. One, generalized consumer protection enforcement agency like the FTC is awesome. I love it. I work there. It is also not necessarily able to do everything for everybody. And in fact, we are speaking in incredibly general terms about technology that is very, very different depending on what it is, right? So I think we need to move the policy conversation into something more specific. And what we need to do is really work with other government agencies that are expert regulators to evolve their understanding of the technology, convene and try to work together on solutions. That's actually going to take a really important innovation in government in the U.S. that we started in the Obama administration, and I'm worried about whether we're continuing, which is including technologists front and center with in government agencies, with policymakers, so that we have people who understand the technology and how it's working, helping inform the decisions that are being made about what's appropriate here. That's a really big, important innovation, and we really need to continue it in order to get the right solutions, I think, and present them to people. Now, I would argue the White House, actually the office that you used to work in, Nicole,
doesn't have any meetings.
Which apparently isn't well-staffed at the moment, is a really good office for convening all the different parts of government that have equities in the debates about what we're doing about autonomous cars or medical devices or any of these other kinds of technologies we're talking about in order to try to get some of the right solutions to the table. But as has been pointed out, they don't appear to be actively working on these issues right now. So that's unfortunate. I do think it also has to be a global conversation as well. These are really complicated questions, and just like we have in the privacy space, we're going to have different norms that we have to balance. In the privacy space, this is a real challenge. In the U.S., though, we do have some really nice analog world, brick-and-mortar world red lines that we've held onto pretty well for the last 30 years, 40 years. The civil rights laws, right? Equal opportunity laws, Fair Credit Reporting Act is one of my favorites because we enforce it at the FTC. But we have areas in the brick-and-mortar world in which we have decided to make sure that there are special protections for people when they're accessing credit or housing or jobs in order to protect those choices. So I think some of these laws are really good frameworks that we've already agreed around where we can really say, look, we have this norm, we need to make sure we're importing it into the digital world.
What do you think, Vanita, about all of this?
So, I mean, I think that that both of my co-panelists have raised really good suggestions. And back in the day, we would have had, through the White House, the ability to have high-level principals engaged from every federal agency, really thinking through some of the questions on big data, AI, and bias and inclusion in civil rights and civil liberties. And one way that some of us had been thinking about this is that once you have kind of the politicals engaged, that ultimately one notion would be that you ingrain and embed technologists, but also advocates in the offices of civil rights that exist in every federal agency that are really tasked with thinking through these issues of AI and bias and civil rights enforcement, that are enforcing every slew of civil rights statutes that exist in the country. Now, again, sorry to paint the bleak picture, the civil rights machinery in the federal government right now is being pretty harshly taxed or eroded in various parts. And so imagining how that could actually happen right now and be institutionalized is difficult. But I think that there could be a real value just long term about institutionalizing in career staff who have day in and day out the responsibility of really thinking through some of these cutting-edge questions and having that kind of task force working through these things. I, right now, would put my hope more in having kind of independent agency that is that is operating, and it may just be that it's a private sector kind of really effective coalition of thinkers on this stuff, but it's a mix, as I said, of the right people around the table that are coming up with some guiding principles and breaking it down. AI is so many different things in different sectors, and so understanding the way in which AI is important and can be used to, as the last speaker on the last panel said, to actually potentially point out where biases is coming into human decision making, but also to ensure that there is an ability to evaluate and study where bias may be entering into AI. I think there should be kind of something that some kind of body that is doing that on a regular basis, broken down by the different uses of AI in different sectors. But ultimately, the long-term game would be, would hope, is more of an institutionalization of this very set of inquiries in every federal agency because of the amount of funding and work that they are propagating in every community around the country.
So can I just jump in for a second? Because I think we also have a threshold problem right now, which is we need to understand more about what is actually happening. And in order to do that, we need organizations like this one. We need civil society. We need research. And one of the things we could be doing at the federal level is sorting through some of the laws that actually are barriers to performing that kind of research in the first place, which is also a conversation that we're not having. And I think it's a significant one because we need to make sure that we can continue to have a way in which we can conduct some of the testing and work and research that is going to help us understand what's happening.
Absolutely. Let's go back to Vanita's point for a moment about market forces and the private sector, because one of the things I've spent a lot of time thinking about, Terrell, I know you, I actually know all of you have in different ways, thinking about is how do you empower the individual in these contexts, in these ecosystems? And, you know, on some level, look, we've clearly over-leveraged notice and choice. And I think probably 99% of the people in the audience would say, how could you possibly do transparency, engage in transparency and notice and choice in an AI system? But I wonder about that. I mean, is there some usefulness to having that market force so that consumers are walking with their feet? I mean, or voting with their fingers on their keyboards, right? And moving away from entities that are mistreating them. And concomitantly, are there companies that are going to be saying, you know, we're not going to wait for the federal government to create an independent agency. We're going to set up a standard-setting organization. We're going to set up a partnership on AI, which we know already exists. You know, are there going to be forces out there that will leverage the market to get us to a better place with respect to AI, or to a place where we can at least begin to trust it and understand it?
So I think that's a really hard question for a bunch of reasons, but like one is
I only ask hard questions.
I know, so it's what I love about you, but it's not always fabulous. So to try and answer the question, so there's one layer of that, which is just the transparency of when does a company let you know that they're using AI to make a decision, right? And again, we haven't agreed what's the right trigger, because it can't be all of them, because I get enough notifications and I don't read the ones I get. So like it can't be all of them, and so it should be the important ones, and then we have to get to some agreement on what's important, right? I also think what my engineering friends tell me, right, is how am I supposed to get your consent to give you notice about how your data is going to get used when I don't know yet, but I'm pretty sure one day in the future it'll be really important, and I don't know. So how does that consent work? Because at the FTC and in Europe, right, specific consent, right, enough to let a person know what the boundaries of that use will be, and I think that big data analytics and machine learning AI kind of is in real tension with that notion, and that's a really big challenge. Which, from a regulatory perspective, does that mean you clamp down on uses to make it not harmful to people to have those secondary uses?
Right.
I mean, the issue for me as I'm thinking through that question is I don't know what that looks like. What does notice and consent even mean? And when AI is being used in the criminal justice context or by police departments in encounters with African-American men on the streets in certain kind of neighborhoods in Chicago, just for instance, or LA, where they're using predpol. And so, I mean, that relationship that in that particular context, that question becomes much more charged, where the power dynamic with who is using predictive policing and who the subjects are is already so skewed. So it certainly in the criminal justice context, I don't think is an answer to that question, because residents in Chicago or Los Angeles may very well know that their police department is using predictive policing and may not understand the first thing about what the algorithm is, what is actually there's a lack of transparency still about the uses of that. And so it becomes a little bit tricky just to rely on market forces, so to speak. When I say that I think it's important for the private sector to come together, I think there's a lot of potential in having kind of not necessarily a government-sponsored independent agency, but a group of, as I said, kind of people who are very deeply engaged in this, that are setting standards and asking the right questions in different contexts about the use of AI.
I mean, I think we're pushing a lot of things together in a very complicated conversation. So
we only have 30 minutes
and like 30 seconds left.
Exactly.
So I guess I would say, just as a federal trade commissioner, I'm not prepared to get rid of the concepts of notice and choice in a privacy context, so nobody misinterpret what I'm about to say, please. And I think that we still need to hang on to these concepts when we're thinking about providing people with information so that they can make informed choices about what is happening when they exchange data for services and other things. I think that's incredibly important. And I think in many cases what's happening is people's value, their data is potentially being undervalued in that transaction, or they're not valuing it enough. And so what I would love is for everybody to be an incredibly informed consumer, and for all of us to understand how all of this technology works all the time, but that's simply not possible, as Nicole pointed out, nor is it even really that useful in our day-to-day lives necessarily. But I think there's such a tremendous information asymmetry that I don't see that there's a market force here that corrects it if we are simply taking humans and consumers out of the equation entirely, absent some sort of regulation, right? So that tees up, well, what is the regulation? And there's some really foundational questions that we haven't answered yet, which is when are we going to say, okay, that's a choice the humans are going to make, and that's a choice the machines are going to make? And we don't know all of the answers to those questions. Now, I've suggested, I think we have some guideposts from the brick and mortar world that we can bring in here, where we've already established when we want to know how and why someone's making a decision about us. I want to know what my credit score is. I want to see what's on my credit report so I can understand why I'm getting the certain kinds of offers that I'm getting. And so I think we need to continue to be able to have ways to engage with this material and in the ways in which the machines are making decisions about us. I'm not sure exactly what format that takes. It's going to be different than the FIPS privacy policies, right? But I'm not prepared to give up the notion of consent as a human. Sorry.
That's why I asked the question. I think it raises an incredibly important issue, and transparency. You know, there's a sunshine effect to the fact that if a company knows it's going to have to make a disclosure, or a police department knows it's going to have to disclose its practices over the past year, that could make it start thinking about, well, gosh, you know, we actually need to make sure that we're saying and we're doing good things with respect to AI, and that we can stand up to what we're doing. All right. Well, our time is definitely up. So would you please join me in thanking our panel on governance under Trump?
Thank you.